What's going on, everybody? You've got the card board coach here with your boy, Coach Co. And team, we have an emergency podcast on our hands. And I have here Mr. Bill from EFIS Pitch here to discuss a very, I guess, something that's happening in the present moment and something that, greatly affects our hobby. Bill, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Appreciate you.
Appreciate the coming on board and looking forward to this conversation.
You know, as someone who regularly discusses pertinent topics, I'm talking about you, in an educated manner, who has, a great deal of knowledge in the sports card space. I was like, you know what, like, I think we should have this conversation and really kind of come to some sort of conclusions together. I mean, not to say that you and I have this great pull in the hobby, but, perhaps if we can formulate our thoughts and, come to some sort of conclusions, like maybe we can build from here, maybe we can learn from this experience. And for those of you who are tuning in, who are kind of in the dark right now, I mean, I don't know how you're part of the space and don't know, but that's okay. That's what we're here for. Over the weekend, Darren Ravel broke a story on Action Network regarding it was a Michael Jordan supposed game used jersey that had sold at auction, I believe back in June. The jersey sold for $26,000, despite there being reports of it being game used. The reason why it sold for so little was because they were unable to photo match that jersey to a specific game. And again, for those of you who are unaware of what photo matching is, basically someone takes photographs from in-game or broadcast footage, and much like a fingerprint is able to identify key components of that jersey or piece of memorabilia and match it up to a specific event in which the player or person has worn it. Long story short, the jersey was then authenticated by one of the premier authenticators, My Gray, using two photos that were later found out to be doctored photos submitted by a dead photographer's foundation that was created a month after that jersey had been purchased.
That's great.
And as it looks right now, based on a mountain of evidence, it looks like the friendly neighborhood watchdog, card porn, was at the middle of all of this in some capacity, whether that was him directly submitting the photos and purchasing the item, whether he was working with another individual or individuals, or maybe there's multiple individuals behind this card porn account. It seems very clear, especially because they have since deleted all of their social media surrounding sports cards. Along with a handful of other evidence. He was also in the office of My Gray with the Jordan jersey. He attempted to submit photos to PSA, those exact photos actually, allegedly, at the National, in order for them to authenticate those, and they denied those. And so what we're on here today to discuss is, not so much the authentication of that jersey itself, but how we kind of allowed this anonymous entity to come into the space and to gain notoriety and to operate freely, to the point where they almost pulled off one of the biggest scams in, potentially the sports and memorabilia industry ever.
Yeah, I mean the capacity point sort of, is the point. From my point of view, who is this person? We think it's this Juan Garcia guy who has, I think, an Australian nationality, but has a place in California. But the capacity at which he was operating, I think, is the central question to this entire story, because, as you point out, he sort of sits in the middle of a lot of sort of concentric circles that maintain a lot of influence in the hobby. And I think there's a lot of sort of interconnected events that have happened the last couple of years where he has really been a central figure in all of this. And so I think, peeling back the onion around, Is he a lone wolf? Is he working with organized crime? Is he working with, some of these other influencer types at grander conspiracies? I would guess, and I think this has been, advanced by some other people. Um, if you're in the fraud business, the first thing that you're going to fraud is not $1 million Jordan jersey. And there is a paper trail, which, is sort of coming back to like going back to 2021, where the same individual was, counterfeiting Jordan autographed star cards and passing them off with what looks like legitimate, Beckett, raw card review, items. So it that to me is the story and the only story. I mean, I think there are aspects around the authentication process that are interesting to know, but I think that anytime you have a market that, as you pointed out, where an item that's not photo matched but it's supposedly game used can be X value and magically be worth 20 or 30x the value if a photograph can be authenticated by one or two different authentication sources, you're just opening the door to fraud. The sort of like financial gain is so advanced and so quick that it's sort of worth the risk for a certain segment of the population.
Well, not to mention you kind of pass the buck once someone else authenticates it, right? Like if you
Exactly.
somehow, some way get one of these companies with, the notoriety in the space that are, people have widely regarded as the company to go to, once that buck is passed, I mean, unless someone catches you in that initial exchange, it's very hard to tie you to it. I mean, think about the Logan Paul, the BBCE wrapped box
Yeah.
of
Right.
first edition Pokemon. I mean, how many times did that box change hands? And yes, I mean, the internet sleuths managed to tie it to, let's say, one specific individual, but we still don't know who that person is, right? And it's changed hands so many times. You have no idea how far along the chain that thing was essentially like fraudulently submitted, and then because it was given that stamp of approval, I mean, where who do we go after? Like
That's right.
where do the
That's
who gets reprimanded here?
Yeah, and that's sort of like the original sin of some of these markets, right? Is that it does the buck does get passed, and then all of a sudden it sort of takes a life of its own. And there's been a lot of people that I think have compared the situation to the art market, and I do look. There are some kind of parallels that exist, but provenance plays a lot bigger role in the art market than it does in the card and memorabilia market. I mean, for one thing, it's a market that's existed for 1,000+ years.
Yeah.
For the second reason is because there are, things, there are government agencies, for an example, and we'll probably get into this, that have a vested interest in making sure that market is sort of as clean as it can be. Do I
Yeah.
think that there's fraud that still exists in the art market? Absolutely. But would I buy a Picasso painting today without a direct line of provenance that ties it back to the artist or a gallery that artist worked with? I would not, right? And I think this idea, that there are these thousands of Jordan jerseys or thousands of Kobe jerseys that are just lying in people's basements, waiting to be discovered through two or three photos and create 30 times the value. I think there's a very kind of loose foundation around that hypothesis, and I think there's far too many people that I think have invested a lot of their time and money in sort of not exploiting that advantage, but sort of leaning on that to create provenance in a way that, frankly, I think is pretty hard to verify.
I think that's entirely true when it comes to game used memorabilia, but I think it becomes a lot more difficult when it comes to sports cards because
Yeah,
it is somewhat likely that, a card like a Mickey Mantle, for instance, has been sitting in a basement for 60 plus years untapped. Now, like, is the likelihood still small? Probably, right? But
yeah,
I mean, depending on the collector, depending on the storage situation, depending on who is rifled through that stuff and in what time, like having a high grade vintage card pop up out of nowhere is way more likely than I think, to your point, having like a game used Michael Jordan jersey, like where you don't know where this thing has come from, or it's just popped up out of the blue.
that's right.
I mean, you have
That's
to
right.
assume that several people have tried to authenticate that jersey in the past, right? Like otherwise it wouldn't be selling for $26,000.
You would think so, right? I mean, why would you then, I mean, it just feels like if that's the delta that exists between it being verified and not, it feels like you would go to the ends of the earth to try to get that done.
And for reference, for those of you who are listening, there was a 98 finals jersey worn by Michael Jordan that sold for over $10 million. So, the difference between $26,000 and $10 million is a piece of paper, basically, right? Is that photo matching?
That's
So
right.
that's the fact that, someone hasn't gone to the ends of the earth to photo match this specific thing and is instead saying, like, I'll take the 26K, it should be an indicator.
That's right. That's right.
So let's talk a little bit about, how did we get here in the first place, right? Like, how do we get to a point where this account was able to grow without ever showing their face, was able to associate with the right individuals in the space? Hell, they were even able to pull a prominent card from auction at Golden, essentially, which resulted in a lawsuit. And I'm actually very curious to see what happens now with the Spiegel brothers.
Mm-hmm.
Spinatron posted something, I believe it was yesterday, essentially bringing the question, what was it card porn's maybe play to discredit that patch and potentially buy it on the lows? Maybe they had doctored those original photos in the first place. Maybe they were the ones that submitted those photos to Blowout Forum, or fabricated that evidence in this case in order to buy that card on the lows and then potentially resell it when, magically that information had disappeared.
Yeah, I mean, like I think the sort of origin story of how we got here is very interesting to all this. I mean, I think this is an individual that hadn't been sort of a social media figure for a long time. From what I understand, he sort of entered the hobby right when it started to really pick up steam. It should be noted that Juan has other sort of social media assets, including food porn and a few other web social media platforms that have in excess of millions of followers. Um, to sort of translate that into account with 100,000, just sort of just given his influence with even something like Instagram, isn't a stretch of the imagination, right? And there are obviously ways in which you can buy followers that can super elevate your presence online. I do think that part of what happened here was there was so much sort of momentum that was happening, and in many cases, like social media was sort of at the front end of a lot of this stuff, and a lot of whether it's auction houses or the manufacturers themselves, they're sort of playing catch up with where popular culture was heading, sort of in that kind of pre-COVID and post-COVID era. And I think this individual or individuals was well placed to sort of take advantage of that momentum, and through their clout, right, through their presence, elevate certain taglines and certain agendas that benefited certain people in the hobby. I think there's no question about that. And I think it's true that for each of us, right, and for a lot of the folks in the market, it was a pretty intoxicating thing, right? This person seemed to have, call it elite level access to a lot of these places, an inside track on a lot of things that were top of mind to hobbyists. He or she obviously had a very kind of strong personality, and look, it's face to say this person's not a dumb person, right?
Yeah.
They're quick-witted. They were not afraid to sort of be aggressive, even if it was misplaced. So I think all these things sort of lend itself to this caricature. And I think to a certain degree, the whole anonymity point was one that we didn't push too much against, because I think that people still really value their privacy, and social media is, for a lot of people, notwithstanding you and I, an escape, a form of escapism.
Yeah.
And part of that escapism is around being private, right? And one of the things, frankly, I enjoy most about utilizing social media for cards, for an example, is that it allows me to do that in a way that I can kind of share it with a bunch of other people that are otherwise not known to me,
Yeah.
for the reason that most of my friends that know in the car business think I'm nuts,
Yeah.
right? They don't have that same passion, and I get it. I don't hold that against them. But anyway, I think there was just a sort of a confluence of events that happened that sort of helped elevate this persona, and the person was obviously savvy enough to exploit those advantages in a lot of different ways.
I would agree with you. I also think that, you kind of touched on this early in the episode. I think the lack of regulation and the lack of, I mean, there's no authority figure in the space, right? And so
Yeah.
he kind of self-appointed him, like, I mean, yeah, that's you self-appoint the hobby watchdog. He was the person for the people. He was the person
Mhm.
that if someone had gotten scammed, or some collusion had taken place, or he was the person that you would either tag or would go after an individual like this. And it was made to seem as though this person was had the hobbies back. And you have to start wondering now, like, was the hobbies lust for some sort of a being to have a little bit more control than what's currently in place? Is that a massive factor in
I think it's a really interesting and astute point. I mean, one of the my favorite sayings is even if you're an atheist, you still worship something.
yeah,
And I think that's absolutely true. And I think that his sort of presence, I think, really spoke to what I think a lot of us have felt for some time, whether you've been in the hobby for 30 years or 3 months, and that is there's just sort of this specter of crumminess that exists in a lot of the corners of this industry, right? And it seems like every other day you're reading about some sort of scam. We can talk about maybe the pack odd stuff that I've covered before. It's like this is an industry that almost fights tooth and nail against transparency in all of its forms.
yeah.
It sort of exists under the veil of a lack of transparency.
I
And
mean,
I think there's massive problems with that.
the premier. Sorry to interrupt you, but the premier grading company gives you a grade and no explanation whatsoever.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And look, and I think it's fair to say, I mean, like, people like card porn, I mean, he has a psychopathic personality, right? I mean, and Pat Ryan has talked about this, right? I mean, it's not surprising to me that he wanted to position himself as a watchdog. It's not surprising to me that he had this like cards for kids initiative, right? It's like sometimes the people that most purport themselves to be virtuous are the scummiest people on the freaking planet, right? And
Yeah.
they hide behind these sort of veils of virtue, and they do a lot of virtue signaling, as you're aware of, right? Calling people out, making fun of people making fun of women breaking and stuff like that, even though his name is card porn, um, because they live sort of on that virtue, but it provides them a sort of an air cover to do a bunch of nefarious stuff,
Yeah.
right? And that's why I think in some cases, like nobody thought to question what he or she was doing or they were doing. Because I think that the default for most people was like, well, if he says he's the watchdog, then he's the watchdog.
I feel like there's almost like a Robin Hood type feel to this. Do you know?
Of
Like,
course, of
where
course.
like he's like, robbing the rich and like saving the poor. You know what I mean? Like he was like for the people, and if you want to spend $2 million on this jersey, go for it. I mean, think of the things that he was allegedly caught up in. I mean, you're talking about a multi-million-dollar jersey potentially. The average everyday person isn't going to be affected by that. Jordan star autograph cards, again, like the everyday person is probably not going to be a part of that, right? But the everyday person is on board for
But I
if
mean,
if there's a
the
breaker
most
on a stream pulling a card off screen, like being called out for that, because it's way
no, I
more
mean,
likely that
and look,
that'll
and it's
happen
like
for
I
them.
mean, outside of obviously eBay, I mean, like I don't think it for your audience that may not know sort of the timeline events here. I mean, this is a person who had part of his collection sponsored in a specific auction by Golden, one of the leading auction houses in the country,
Yeah.
right? This is a person who broke millions of dollars of wax with Drake, one of the most famous people on the planet, and Golden, I believe in Toronto, or it might have been Vegas, I forget which.
I have no idea.
This is the same person that was like walking around Dr. Beckett's man cave and looking at his priceless collection of cards the week of the national. Okay. So like this is not just like some innocent, bystander, like a guy like you and I is just like trying to, whatever. I mean, this is like a central figure. And like the question that we should be asking to Ken and to Nat and to Cage and all these other people that at one point in time were pumping this guy up is, what do you know about him? What's your relationship? What's the nature of your relationship? What's the economic nature of your relationship? What items did he win in your auctions, and what items did he submit without us knowing? Right. This is the sort of thing where if we had any regulation, any serious regulation in this industry, that's the sort of questions the feds would be asking.
I mean, he
Right.
literally sold cards with Ken Golden, so it's not like he doesn't know who this person is.
Exactly.
Or not just cards, but like pieces of like
No,
pop culture. Like,
Ken has a bank address.
yeah,
Right. He's got addresses. He's got his social or whatever the Australian equivalency is. Right. Like all those things exist. Okay. And yet who's been silent through this whole thing? This is why I put that meme out there about him sweating bullets.
yeah.
He better be sweating bullets, right? Because if this becomes an international conspiracy, there's only so many degrees of separation exist in some of these situations. And that's
Well,
what we sort of need to get a hold of.
it's going to be a completely different Netflix documentary if that keeps.
Yeah. Ain't that the truth? But I mean, listen, I've spent, I've spent 20 plus years in the financial markets. I buy companies for a living. I know what it means to deal with the SEC and other sort of governing bodies. And I have to say, like, coming back into this hobby a couple of years ago and just learning what I now know, um, this industry is like organized crime's wet dream. Um, any way you look at it, right? I mean, the lack of transparency, the fact that it mostly is sort of cash based, right? Um, the whole setting of private comps, the shill bidding, the ability to sort of recycle dirty money, right? I mean, it is just, and again, and all the constituents that have a major role to play, and I'll be covering this soon. So whether it's the manufacturers themselves, whether it's the auction houses or the grading companies or the breaking operations, right? They all have a vested interest to keep it that way. Transparency is a problem for each of those businesses for different reasons, right? But the collection of those reasons as a consumer, and I think even more importantly as a collector, are the things that we should start demanding. Because if we don't get it, this is going to continue to perpetuate itself. Because here's what I'd say, like our ability to sort of self-police this behavior is almost non-existent. It's complete. If the hobby watchdog castrates himself, it's non-existent. And so again, I'm a small government guy, right? I don't like government in my shorts. Don't get me
Yeah,
wrong.
yeah.
But I'd say that this industry provides, I think, the best case that I've seen for consumer protection. And I think it's particularly true because a lot of the participants in this hobby are children and kids.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like I did this thing, you probably saw. Uh, how many Topps Chrome products exist?
It's a 13.
It's 10, right? 75% of the participants got that wrong. How many Topps Chrome parallels, gold parallels exist, right? 60% of the audience got it wrong. 14. And the amount of people that just like through my DMs were like, oh my gosh, I had no idea. It was sort of like, it's one of those things, right? It's like you just sort of get like stuck in the cycle. It's, oh, this product and this product and this product and this product and this and this and that. And all of a sudden you like, when you start to finally take a deep breath and you say, wait a minute, what's really going on here? Like I like gold refractors, but like, are all gold refractors created equal? Probably not actually.
Yeah.
Right. So I just think it's just one of those things where I've long advocated for, more transparency, more regulation in this industry, because I feel like that's sort of what's standing in the way of creating more sort of serious This is creating this into something to be more serious, right?
Well, we talk about it being an asset class, right? Like that was like
Yeah.
the huge topic of discussion. There were many advocates for, sports cards being an asset class, and in fact that they being equally as liquid as something like a stock.
Right.
Um, right. And so how does that even happen without regulation? Do you know what I mean? Like every single market that like there's an asset class in, there's a regulation. So let's talk a little bit about regulation. What would regulation look like in order to further the hobby from something like this happening again, or just further the
So
hobby along in general?
yeah, I mean, I'll cover it in sort of from a
Yeah.
constituency perspective. I think what it means for manufacturers is the following. Much more in the way of transparency. I mean, Podcasts is one part of that equation. Of course, Topps has done that, but Panini to date has not.
Yeah.
So that needs to be sort of known. I would argue that they need to take it a step further, and instead of letting sort of trading card database and baseball cardpedia, whatever, they should have an encyclopedia as a reference point for their cards, right? That would include things like print runs, right? Um, and look, they sit on all this information already, and so they should go so far as to sort of rebuild it as far back as they can, because
Yeah.
this is sort of like, to me, that's information that sort of the hobby should own, okay? Because it's bedrock to everything that we do. But part of, like, I've long thought about, creating a data and analytics company that, instead of like today, which is like hyper focused on price,
Yeah.
to have a data analytics company that's hyper focused on information itself, right? The problem is that so long as the manufacturers are the gatekeepers of that information, they may have a vested interest in not allowing you to have that information almost at any price,
Yeah.
and therefore the whole specter of trying to do it is moot. But I think for the manufacturers, it's about transparency in production, and it's about educating consumers on what they're buying. Okay. And then I think there has to be, I think, an overlay of sort of quality control. I've talked about this before, where um, there's a correlation between print runs and quality control, right? I mean, there's only so much you can do when you get to these nosebleed levels to control quality in a certain way if
Yeah.
your objective is to sell more products. But I do think that there could be regulation to monitor that a bit, where, like we had with last year's 2022 Topps Chrome, every parallel in that freaking set is off-centered. It's
Yeah.
like, it's absurd, right? You almost have to flip a coin whether or not you're going to get a centered card.
What
And
about
yet
in
there,
the case of like redemptions, where, I mean, you might be buying a product because a popular player is the rookie autograph is in there. Maybe the rookie autograph didn't make it into the product in time. Sometimes you're not getting that back. I mean, one product that comes to mind is the basketball product that featured LaMelo Ball. I believe it was Prism 2020,
yeah,
if I'm not mistaken. LaMelo Ball at the time was a very hyped prospect. All of his autos were redemptions. The price per box, you would have to assume, is because the
yeah,
most prominent player had autographs in that box. And theoretically, they technically did in the form of redemptions, but many people didn't see those redemptions for 2 years, right? So like how,
yeah. I
it's
think I think that
almost,
I think the federal response to that code would be that they would go away.
yeah,
I mean, I'd have to look at the consumer law around this, but I think,
because
like, the
it's almost
promise of
misleading. It has to
goods.
be misleading, right? Like you're
Yeah, I
paying
mean,
$1,200 for something that you might never get. Like even
yeah,
if
I
you
mean,
do, or the odd chance win it, it's like a next level skill testing question. You know how like at the end of like winning something, you got to
yeah.
fill out of skill testing questions. Like this is like that times a million. This is like,
Yeah, I would imagine there has to be other case law around consumer finance, around the delivery of goods, that would apply to a situation like that. Um, that would prohibit them from sort of not delivering, or not having sort of the goods in hand.
like within a time frame at least, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah,
instead of right now, it's like until further notice, a 6 month time frame, or 3 month time frame, or 9 month time frame, or something that's you know somewhat reasonable. Versus there are
yeah.
people who have outstanding redemptions for 11 years, 10 years.
That's right. I think the other thing I think technology can help allow for this. I mean, I think they would have to tighten up a lot of the language around the patch space, right? So, you know, it would just have to be a lot tighter, right? What game was it worn? If it was event, what event was it? I mean, these are
I
things that I
don't think
think
that's that
consumers.
difficult,
No, it's not. And
right?
I think as we go through these constituents, the fact of the matter is like none of this stuff is really that difficult,
Yeah.
right? And I think there's been a lot of people that have come to me as I've sort of advanced some of this stuff and said they'll never do it. And the reason is because it's too difficult. And I think look, if the CFSB, like in the United States, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, can monitor and legislate the U.S. financial system from a consumer related perspective, they can tackle the hobby.
Yeah.
Okay, like this is not that hard. So I think that's the sort of manufacturer point. I think on the auction houses, there needs to be a unified registration system for bidding, right? So if you're going to bid on items for pick your dollar amount, $5,000 or more, there's a unified registration system that exists where you have a specific user ID that's tied back to whatever your government user ID is, right? And that is known by other users.
Okay.
So
So
if you're
like
bidding on gold,
knowing who owes what or who
yeah.
owns
So it's
what.
like
Yeah.
and it's like and that user ID should be tied to not just the bidders themselves, but the cards in those auctions.
Yeah. I mean, ideally across platforms too,
And
right?
across,
Like,
no,
yeah.
that's why it needs to be.
Yeah.
That's why the
Yeah.
government needs to run it, right?
Yeah.
Because it would be like if you're user A and I'm user B, okay, and we've got cards and like let's say you're selling cards in PWCC and I'm selling cards in Golden and we're bidding on each other's cards, right?
Yeah.
You and I should have at least one identifier to know that each other is doing that,
Yeah.
right? And there should be an ability to go into a Golden and search for cards by user ID. Who's selling what cards, right? Is somebody holding like six of a by 10 parallel that they're all trying to dump
Yeah.
at once? Are they bidding on their same card? Right. I mean, again, just a simple fix like that, which again, the auction houses would never go for
Ever.
unless they're forced to do it,
Yeah.
solves a boatload of the problems that exist in this space. So I think that's on the auction houses. That's one thing, right? I think that would be impossible to legislate at eBay, but I do think in the auction houses themselves, that next level of security would be important. Um, I also think on the auction houses themselves, I think just better transparency around listings needs to happen, right? I mean, there are many times where I'll go and like the listing itself is so generic as to be laughable, right? Like, and this is where I think
Do you think it's because they want to make it more searchable?
I'm not sure actually.
Okay.
I'd want to know. I'd love to talk to somebody about it.
Yeah.
But I think this is where like the carry-on effect of having the database functionality at the manufacturers allows the auction houses to have a seamless experience for the auction
Just
house.
port that information over.
Boom.
Yeah.
Right? Boom.
Yeah.
The next is the grading companies. So I think as I think about legislation or regulation in that space, I think it's about how do you ensure, again, from a user registration perspective, things like the same serial numbered card isn't submitted 8 times, for an example.
Yeah. I think that they're getting better at that now. Like
Yeah.
I've heard now, I heard this from a secondary source, so I mean, I don't know if it's entirely true, but someone had mentioned to me that they sent in, I think it was an 8, it was a card number to 5, a number to 10. They cracked the card out. It was a PSA 8. They cracked it out. They resent it in, and PSA sent it back to them with the same serial number the first one had. So
That's good.
they were like, this is already in the system as this. Here you go. And they were kind of like taken back by that. They were like, what the hell? So now that I think they're scanning things, I think it's more likely to get things like serially numbered cards, pretty good across the board. Now, of course, there's no cohesion between PSA, SGC, and
That's
BGS,
right.
right? So, if a card is marked altered, let's say with one company, it won't be altered with another one potentially, right?
Yeah.
And variance in grades also exists at that same capacity.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I think that the grading companies would be the hardest to regulate because and I think they'd have a very strong legal case for this. What they would say to a company and to a man and woman is, um, you're paying for our opinion.
Yep.
And there is a lot. I mean, and again, I'm not saying it's wrong, right, or indifferent. There's a lot of legal sort of there's a lot of legal backdrop that supports that sort of perspective. So I think that would be the hardest to legislate.
And none of them are liable though, right? Like none of them have insurance policies except for PSA has a very
Yeah, but even PSAs, right? I mean, the issue with any sort of guarantee, and Dave, Silent Slab has talked about this, right? Um, and I've dealt with this with other sort of guarantee related products.
yeah,
The the way in which you manage a guarantee policy is you make the guarantee experience so arduous and over time so expensive that the sort of teeth of the guarantee go away,
yeah,
right? So imagine, for an example, you bought a card that ended up becoming, for some odd reason, a known fake, and but you're like the sixth person to own the card since it was originally
graded.
slabbed,
Yeah.
right? How do you? It's like reparations. Like how do you like tie that back, right? Who gets what? How is that card made whole, right? I mean, and again, like
I guess the
I don't have.
registry is one way of like establishing ownership, right? And I think that's not enough people take advantage of the registry,
Yeah,
quite frankly.
I think that's one of the the least utilized but most
Yeah.
important tools that those guys provide. I
Yeah.
agree.
Yeah,
I
because at
agree.
least there's a transparency on who owns what, and like once I mean I've had it happen to me where I've sell a card and I forget to remove it from my registry, and I get a notification on my phone saying, "Hey, so and so tried to add this to the registry," like, and then I just
Yeah,
accept it, and I'm like, "Yeah, no worries, we're good." And so at least you have some sort of transparency in terms of like ownership there.
yeah, and again, I think this is where like even the registration system would be impactful, right? Because sometimes I just forget to do it, right?
Yeah,
Like there's nothing in the form where you can just like click a button and all of a sudden it just
it just adds
loads up.
everything to your
Yeah, I mean,
account.
like that should
Yeah,
be so easy, right?
yeah,
And again, I think part of this is complicated by the fact that you've got, group subs who, maintain a lot of control in the hobby, but it shouldn't matter. If you have a universal ID, you have a universal ID, and that should be used, in the case of group subs or individual subs.
yeah.
And then the final category that I mentioned earlier around regulation would be breaking. And look, I think this is obviously an industry that's in its very early days of maturation. Um, we shouldn't be surprised that there's pitfalls and stuff like that. I would generally say that most breaking operations are in it for customer service and customer service as first instance, and that's great. But I think that having 360-degree video monitoring, a specific set of guidelines and rules around transparency for slot pricing, right? Um, so you can limit manipulation. Again, unified registration system. So you limit, XYZ breaks, and half the pool is filled by other people that work at the break, for example, right?
Yep.
The registration
Yeah,
system
yeah.
will require you to acknowledge affiliations, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
Um, and then I think a uniform set of packaging standards. I mean, I've heard some horror stories of people getting paralleled cards in bags and just stupid shit, right?
Yeah.
And that stuff has got to, I think there's a way to regulate that.
Do you think that Fanatics has the capability and or desire to regulate in that manner?
I think that's where they will take control of the market. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I
I,
mean that's exactly what like when you're talking about how to regulate breaking and certain standards, and I know that Fanatics Live is in its infancy, and but I guarantee you that, like, I mean, the way that they've been very selective on who's able to break on the app, I suspect they're going to continue to do something of that nature, and it's going to be very exclusive.
yeah.
And because there's not going to be any more business to business transactions, I mean, this is what you get if you want to break with someone, unless you want to buy from a secondary
Well,
market, in which case it's like the person selling to you is at risk of kind of maybe losing their license with Fanatics, or but also it's kind of like user beware, right? Like it's almost like buying medication from someone off the street versus the
Yeah,
pharmacy, right?
it's
Like,
such a good analogy.
yeah,
I mean, and like the thought experiment I've played for people is think about other sort of consumer related products, and like, and then just like like think about the last 10 years, and think about the power of having a consumer product like 2 or 3 weeks before anybody else does, right? Like
yeah,
you're probably a video game guy. I'm a video
yeah,
game guy, right? I mean, it's gotten to the point now where people pay in some cases 20 or 30% to play the game 3 days before.
yeah. Well, like
Well,
FIFA,
what if
FIFA is a massive one like that, right? Like
right,
it's
right?
like
So like what if what's stopping Fanatics from like, I mean, I like Stephanie and Mama Breaks. Like,
yeah.
hey Stephanie, like you're gonna have 30-day early access to Topps Chrome. I mean, game over, dude.
I mean, especially in the manner in which they print product. Like no one's going to be ripping Topps Chrome in 30 days. Do you know what I mean? Like they might
Yeah,
still be a little bit, but there's like there's two more products that follow that up within 30 days.
it's just game. It's game over.
Yeah.
It's game over. Right. So
Yeah.
look. I think that frankly, if that's the decision they decide to do, which I think is probably smart, that decision will have a way of regulating the market itself.
So do you think that if and when there's regulation with the breaking, that then they have the ability to kind of pull other regulations in the direction that they want, or other
Possibly.
regulatory, right? Because I mean, if you control
Well, I think
product, right? Like if you
I
control, theoretically, you're controlling product, right? And how that product is distributed. I mean, it's kind of like my rules or see you later.
yeah. I mean, look. I think that and I'm not saying that Ruben and team have miscalculated in this way, and maybe secretly they wish for it. But anytime you see massive sort of consolidation of power in an industry, it starts to garner the attention of regulators.
Yeah.
Um, this is true obviously in the banking industry. It's been true in other industries. It's been true in the auto industry and a few others. And I think while it's a small sort of piece of the economy, I think that part of this sort of consolidation effort led by Fanatics and frankly by Collectible, um, allow the sort of ability to regulate to be a lot more seamless, right? Because they don't
Mm-hmm.
have to deal with a bunch of they don't have to deal with Brian Gray and his bullshit.
Yes.
They
Yeah.
can go straight to the source and cover most of the market as a result. And that's what I think that they'll do. And again, I think it's like one of those things where, because people have kind of dismissed this idea that I've had for some time now, it's only going to take somebody with too much money and too much time and the right connections in places like Washington to get burned really bad for this to be a serious problem for people. Because once that happens, I mean, I've got some friends that work in Washington. Once that snowball starts rolling down the hill, it's very hard to stop it. And look, I'm a small government guy, and I at this point in time, I'd welcome it for all the reasons that we've discussed today.
I think there's a lot. I mean, based on some of the arguments that you've made, I can definitely see why it would be beneficial to have some sort of governing body, and as also as like a very like I mean, I think that the less government involvement is probably the best in generally when it comes to
Yes.
everyday life. I think that part of this whole thing as well. I mean, we talk a little bit about transparency. There's just overall a lack of information for
Yes.
collectors, right? And like
Yes.
I'm not even talking like short-term information. I'm even talking like current information, because I think that like current information there's probably never been more of. But even like in past instances, or to your point, like past print runs,
Yeah.
like where can collectors go for this information? And I think that's another reason why people kind of glommed onto card porn, because there was, I mean, they would bring up instances in the past occasionally where like don't forget when like so and so, when this happened and when this happened. And so, maybe if it's not talking about specific instances, but
Hmm.
even to your point, like creating an encyclopedia, like there's just not enough information for the everyday collector to make educated decisions in the space, I don't think.
No, I mean, it's kind of interesting that you bring this up because I had a friend of mine, sort of an old college buddy who, we just kind of kept up, over the years. He lives now in Maryland, and he called me up randomly like a week ago and was like, "Hey, I know that you're sort of into this card thing, and I've got a 12-year-old son, and but I'm like completely lost, and I was hoping to kind of get like 30 minutes of your time to like talk about it." And I said, "Okay, well, can you tell me a little bit about like your experience so far?" And he talked about how, his son has it was on, Whatnot or whatever. Oh,
Yeah.
is it Whatnot? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And, and like as a
Which is also
Pokemon
crazy
person,
that a 12-year-old is like just buying like cards at auction on Whatnot.
but
But
it's, yeah,
anyway.
super, but yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Right. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, and he's on Whatnot and he's, on these breaks and yada, yada, yada. And he's like, I took that experience and I'm like a Giants fan. And so I participated in this break for this football product and I got this card and like, sort of, what do I do with it? And I remember, again, it didn't happen that very long ago. I mean, I remember thinking to myself, like, I need 6 hours to tell you just like sort of the foundational things that I would have loved to have known 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Right. And so if it's, and this guy, he's highly educated, right? He's got a lot of disposable income, right? And he is absolutely completely confused as
Just
to what to do,
lost. Yeah.
just completely lost, right? And again, like, is a sort of person that will likely just spend money to spend money and then, come up for air 6 months from now and be like, what the hell did I just do? Right. And in the process, his son's addicted to Whatnot freaking breaks. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where I remember this guy's name is Brian. I remember telling Brian, like, Brian, just like, do me a favor, call me, at this date when I have more time, because like, I really want you to enjoy this, but you're not if you stay on this path. I mean, one of the
Yeah.
things that I said coming out of the national is, um, collecting is fun. The hobby makes it hard.
Yeah.
And that's so true, right? It's so freaking much harder than it needs to be. And so much of that, I think, is the lack of investment that's been made by any one of these companies that we've
I
talked about in the sort of foundational aspects of knowledge in the industry. If you can solve that problem, I mean, like, how much would you pay a month to have at your fingertips like an encyclopedia of
I
cards?
I don't know, man. A lot more than people are paying for a card ladder, to be honest. Like, I mean, I
Yeah,
think that's way more important than prices themselves, because then you can make your own educated, like, is this rare
exactly.
or not? Do you know what I mean? Like, is this
Exactly.
rare or not? Maybe you have like number of sales or some feature like that. I don't know, but at the very least, you just have like information. Like, I remember I was trying to figure out what the first year of Topps atomic refractors were, and I asked Adam, and I was like, I must have dug online for, I mean, 20-30 minutes, and like, I know which sites are credible. Do you know,
Yeah.
like, when it comes to like sports cards, right? And even me, I
Yeah.
was like, okay, like, where is this information, right? And I was just like, this is, I can't imagine, first of all, the average person even knowing what an atomic refractor is, right? Like
Zero chance.
no
Zero.
chance, right? Like
Yeah.
sparkly refractor or something of that nature. I mean, occasionally they're labeled, but I don't think they are these days. Um, it's just, I think it just says refractor, right? And then you would have to look at the pack odds, at least when it comes to Topps products, and figure out exactly what that refractor was. But in many cases, there's a lot of people that have no idea what like a no huddle is, or what's the difference between a first off the line box and a hobby box. What's the difference between a mega box and a retail box, right? Like, there's so many things that I just think the average person who might want to get into the space, or maybe does participate in the space, we just assume should know, and
Yes.
they have no access to that information whatsoever, unless they've been in the hobby for a considerable amount of time, in which case we're not doing a very good job of acclimating either new members or potential new members into the space.
100%. I mean, I think it's, it's the part of the hobby that needs the most investment and it has the least of it. That's what's so paradoxical, right? I'm going to talk to somebody about this topic and, in a future live or something. But I mean, there's a couple sort of like cultural and societal reasons why like this is such a problem, right? And believe it or not, it ties back to something like fundamental, like the father-son relationship to the
Yeah.
hobby,
Yeah.
right? And again, I'm not trying to grandstand or get political, but
Yeah.
if you see, as the sort of as the family breaks down, so does the hobby, right? Because that link that exists between father and son, their collecting experience, how they enrich their son or their daughter with that experience, right? Once that link is broken, it's really, really hard to get it back, right? And unless you have something that sort of fuses it back together, which I would argue is this sort of knowledge repository,
Yeah.
it ain't gonna happen, man. And we're gonna wake up 10 years from now and people are gonna be like, people were trying to buy, pick your product, XYZ poo poo refractor. Like, what are people thinking? I mean, that's the sort of, if you could predict the future, I think that's the sort of future that's gonna come if this isn't solved.
And that's what makes this hobby so susceptible to fraudulent activities and like extreme swings in price, like because of a lack of knowledge. I think it's just so easy for someone to simplify information for the everyday person, and all of a sudden, because it's simplified, people are like, I understand this, give me one. Do you know, like
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
so, because it's been oversimplified and nothing in the space is and explained properly, it's like, oh, I get it, boom. Like, I remember I made the video about the John Morant parallel, and
yeah,
I don't own any of them. I don't know anyone that does. Like, if you do, congratulations, whatever. I don't care. But
yeah.
I just found it interesting that there was so many people on this card, right? But just sharing that card, despite the Menendez brother having, I mean, we know about the 90 hoops
Yeah,
Menendez brothers card,
yeah,
and I'm sure it had its day in the sun as well. But it's like, if people don't know that Menendez brother card exists and that what that price point is, and I would say, like, we don't know what the final print runs are for 90s hoops and 2019 basketball chronicles,
right.
but I would assume it. I mean, it's the same level of mass production, I think, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So generally speaking, I can't say that either of those is rarer than the other, but because people were pointed in the direction of one, everyone was like, "Oh my god, I need this card." And I'm like, "No, no, no, just wait." Like, all I did was show you this new piece of information about the card. I didn't necessarily say buy it. I also said, just to be aware that there are other cards like this exist. And I just, in that moment, I saw how susceptible this hobby is to just kind of glomming onto a piece of
hmm
information because there's such a lack of it.
that's right. That's right. Yeah, and again, and again, this is more of a societal point. We society is changing in ways that it's moving so quickly we can't even react to it, right?
Yeah.
So think about, I made this thing about Bob and the leopard print speedo. The whole point of that was to say, like, when your attention span is this big,
Yep.
the amount of information that can fit into it is very, very small, right? And your ability just to focus, take a step back, and just understand what's happening around you is almost zero, right? And so much of, I think, what's been driving sort of hobby participation is that phenomenon, right? That's fueled by the ways in which these algorithms work and the way that social media is programmed. Um, and,
And
and
instant
but
gratification. Like, I
yeah,
mean,
and
think
it's
about
just it's
breaks
just
and hits and
yeah, and it just is it's it's turning us into a bunch of maniacs, um, and unthoughtful maniacs. And it's like, when is somebody just gonna? And this is why, like, listen, this stuff is exhausting to me, right? I do have better uses of my time,
of
but
course.
I see it so much around me. I feel like I have like an obligation, whether it's to you or to Dave or other people, just to say something because
Yeah.
I look around me. I mean, the car porn is a great example of this. Like, the story broke and it was like 20 hours later and nobody said anything.
Yeah.
I'm
Well, I
like,
felt the same way where I was like, I
was
just
like, what
felt
the hell?
I had to sit in my thoughts and like think about, like, how do we proceed here, and like, what do
Yeah,
people need in this moment, like, how can we move out of this, like, how can we prevent, I mean, much of the questions that we were asking at the beginning of this show, right? Like, these are all things that
yeah,
were going through my head, and I'm like, how can we make this better, maybe not instantly, but like in the future. And
yeah, dude. It's nuts. But
well, I mean, one thing's for sure, as long as we got you on the side of change, then hopefully we're going to be steered in the right direction. Bill, where can people find you if they want to see this encyclopedia when it gets built out, if they want, create. First of all, I should actually give you. Actually, I'm going to give you my own plug. If you want creative stories, if you want the opportunity to gain knowledge in the space, whether it's from a reel or a poll where the results are shared and percentages are calculated, I would highly, highly, highly recommend you follow EFIS_pitch. I got that right?
You did. Thank you.
On Instagram. You're very welcome. And Bill is honestly one of the good ones for sure.
Thanks, Co. I appreciate you saying that.
Got you, man. Of course.
Yeah, look, it's been great to be on here. I'm glad this is just the sort of topic that I think you and I can sink our teeth into. And look, I think there'll be obviously a lot of talking heads around this subject. But I hope that people sort of pay attention to a lot of what we talked about here, which is, sort of don't get distracted by the fringe elements of this conspiracy. Demand answers to the central problem that exists within it. And that is, who is this person? Who are they involved with? And what else do we need to know? That to me, because I think if you can kind of unravel that, we can maybe get this kind of hobby back on track. If not, then I think it'll just continue to repeat itself, and that's unfortunate.
I mean, it seems like it's cyclical, right? Like it just seems like
Yeah.
something of this magnitude happens every 10 years, 15 years. It's different actors, but same stuff roughly,
Yeah. It is.
So no, I couldn't agree more. Bill, thanks again for joining today, team. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Like I said, you have to go follow EFIS Pitch. And for now, Coach Co and Bill are out of here. Peace.